At 5:20 in the morning on August 19th, 1942, the first landing craft scraped against the pebbled shore of a small French port town. In the grey half-light before dawn, hundreds of young Canadian soldiers stepped into the shallow water and began wading toward a beach they had never seen before. Within seconds, the silence was torn apart by the hammering of German machine guns firing from the cliffs above. Tracer rounds streaked across the water like burning needles. Men fell face down into the surf, their packs dragging them beneath the waves. The stones beneath their boots were not sand but large, loose pebbles that sucked at their feet with every step, slowing their advance to an agonizing crawl. Behind them, more landing craft were grinding ashore, dropping their ramps into a wall of fire. The port town was called Dieppe, and what happened there over the next 9 hours would become one of the bloodiest single days in Canadian military history, a catastrophe so complete that it would reshape the entire Allied strategy for the invasion of Europe. But this disaster, this terrible morning of slaughter on a forgotten stretch of the French coast, would ultimately save tens of thousands of lives. Because without the lessons written in blood at Dieppe in 1942, the great Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the operation the world remembers as D-Day, might never have succeeded at all. To understand why nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers were sent across the English Channel on that August morning, you have to understand the desperate strategic situation facing the Allies in the summer of 1942. Britain had been at war for nearly 3 years. The fall of France in June 1940 had left the British Empire standing virtually alone against Nazi Germany. The entry of the Soviet Union into the war in June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, had provided a powerful but desperately embattled ally, and the entry of the United States after Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had promised eventual victory. But in the summer of 1942, that victory seemed very far away indeed. On the Eastern Front, the German army was driving deep into the southern Soviet Union, pushing towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Premier Joseph Stalin was demanding with increasing fury that Britain and America open a second front in Western Europe to draw German divisions away from the east. Without such a front, Stalin warned, the Soviet Union might collapse under the weight of the German offensive. The Americans, led by General George Marshall, were pressing for an early cross-channel invasion, but the British, painfully aware of how unready they were for such an enormous undertaking, resisted. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had recently survived a vote of confidence in the House of Commons, but his political position was weakened by a string of military setbacks. Singapore had fallen in February. Tobruk had surrendered in June. The Royal Navy was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. Something had to be done. Something visible, dramatic, and aggressive. Something to show Stalin that the Western Allies were not sitting idle while Russian soldiers died by the millions. Into this cauldron of political pressure stepped a man whose ambition matched his royal connections. Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, a great-grandson of Queen Victoria and second cousin of King George VI, had been appointed Chief of Combined Operations in March 1942. His mandate was to develop the techniques and equipment of amphibious warfare and to mount raids against the coast of occupied Europe. Mountbatten was charming, energetic, and supremely confident. He was also, as events would prove, willing to take risks with other men's lives that would haunt the survivors for the rest of theirs. In April 1942, Mountbatten's staff at Combined Operations Headquarters in Whitehall began planning a large-scale raid on the French port of Dieppe. The town sits on the Norman coast, roughly midway between Le Havre and Boulogne, backed by steep chalk cliffs and fronted by a broad pebble beach. The original plan, codenamed Operation Rutter, called for a frontal assault on the town by Canadian infantry and tanks, with British Commandos attacking the heavy gun batteries on the flanks. Paratroopers would drop behind the batteries to silence them before the main force hit the beach. A heavy bombardment by the Royal Air Force would soften the defences, but as the plan developed, it was stripped of nearly every element that might have given it a chance of success. Air Marshal Arthur Harris of Bomber Command refused to divert his aircraft to support what he considered a sideshow. Churchill worried about French civilian casualties from heavy bombing. The Royal Navy, still reeling from the loss of the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya in December 1941, refused to commit any warship larger than a destroyer. The heaviest guns available to support the landing would be 4-inch naval guns, weapons wholly inadequate to suppress fortified positions in concrete and cliff faces. The paratrooper element was eventually replaced by seaborne commandos, removing the plan's dependence on favourable flying weather but also eliminating the element of deep surprise behind the enemy positions. The force chosen to carry out the main assault was the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General John Hamilton Roberts. The Canadians had been in Britain since late 1939, training endlessly, garrisoning the coast against a German invasion that never came. They were well trained, eager for action, and frustrated by years of inactivity. Their government had been pressing for Canadian troops to be committed to battle. The catastrophic loss of 2 Canadian battalions at Hong Kong in December 1941 had only intensified the desire to prove Canadian soldiers in a major engagement. The men of the 2nd Division were volunteers to a man, drawn from regiments across the breadth of Canada, from the Royal Regiment of Canada in Toronto to the Essex Scottish Regiment in Windsor, from the South Saskatchewan Regiment in the Prairies to the Fusilier Mont-Royal in Montreal, from the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders in Winnipeg to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the regiment known simply as the Rileys. Operation Rudder was scheduled for early July 1942, during a favourable tidal window between the 4th and 8th of July. The troops embarked on the Isle of Wight, but bad weather forced postponement, and while the ships lay at anchor, German aircraft bombed 2 of the assault vessels. On July 7th, Rudder was officially called off. In the aftermath, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, then commanding Southeastern Command, wrote to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff recommending that no similar operation should ever be attempted again. Surprise had been compromised, he argued. Too many people knew the target. It should have ended there, but it did not. Within days of the cancellation, Mountbatten and Captain John Hughes Hallett, the naval planner, pressed for the operation to be revived. Montgomery had departed for Egypt to take command of the 8th Army. With his objections removed, Mountbatten obtained what he later described as verbal authorization from Churchill to remount the raid. No written order was ever issued. No signed document authorizing the operation has ever been found in the British archives. The plan was revived under a new code name, Operation Jubilee, but it was essentially the same plan against the same target, with the same troops launched barely 6 weeks after the first attempt had been abandoned for reasons of compromised security. The decision to remount an operation whose security had been blown against a target where the defenders were now on heightened alert remains one of the most criticised command decisions of the entire war. On the evening of August 18, 1942, a fleet of 237 ships and landing craft sailed from ports along the south coast of England: Portsmouth, Southampton, New Haven, Gosport and Shoreham. Aboard were approximately 6,100 men. Nearly 5,000 were Canadians of the 2nd Division. The remainder included roughly 1,000 British Commandos and Royal Marines, 50 American Rangers of the 1st Ranger Battalion, the first Americans assigned to ground combat in Europe against the Germans, and a small contingent of Free French Commandos. The naval force was commanded by Captain Hughes Hallett from the headquarters destroyer HMS Calpe. The air operation was under Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, who committed 74 squadrons of fighters and fighter bombers, the largest single-day air operation the RAF had yet mounted. The men had been assembled on August 15th under the pretense of a routine training exercise. Only the senior officers knew the truth, having been told at a briefing in Chichester 4 days before the crossing that this would be the real thing. The rank and file discovered the nature of their mission only as the ships sailed south into the Channel. Now, crammed into the steel bellies of landing ships, they knew. The Channel crossing was calm. The sea was flat, almost oily in the darkness. The engines of the landing craft throbbed steadily beneath the men's feet. Above them, the August sky was clear and full of stars. To the south, somewhere beyond the black horizon, the coast of France was waiting. Most of these men had never been in combat. They were young, drawn from the farms, factories and cities of a country that had been at war for nearly 3 years, but had committed its army to precious little fighting. They had trained for this moment for 2.5 years, and now that it had arrived, the silence of the crossing was heavier than any noise could have been. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on 6 beaches spread across a 16-kilometre front. On the flanks, British Commandos would land at dawn 0450 hours to destroy 2 heavy gun batteries that could devastate the main assault force. Number 4. Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat would attack the Hesse battery at Varengerville to the west, mounting 6 150mm guns. Number 3. Commando under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater would attack the Goebbels battery at Bernevald to the east, mounting 3 170mm and 4 105mm guns. At the same time, Canadian battalions would land at Puys to the east and Pourville to the west to seize the headlands overlooking the main beach. Then, 30 minutes later, at 0520 hours, the main assault would go in. Canadian infantry and tanks of the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, known as the Calgary Regiment, would storm directly onto the Dieppe esplanade in a frontal attack on the fortified town. The Germans were ready. The Dieppe sector was held by the 302nd Static Infantry Division under Major General Conrad Hasse, a force of roughly 6,000 men in well-prepared defensive positions. Despite British intelligence assessments that described Dieppe as lightly defended, the Germans had turned the seafront into a killing ground. Machine gun positions had been dug into the cliff faces and into caves beneath the headlands. The seafront buildings, including a large casino and the hotels along the promenade, had been converted into strongpoints. A concrete seawall topped with barbed wire ran the length of the beach. Every street exit from the esplanade was blocked with concrete anti-tank obstacles, and on July 20th, General Oberst Kurt Haas, commander of the German 15th Army, had issued an order to his troops identifying 3 forthcoming tidal windows particularly favourable for an Allied amphibious landing, one of which fell between August 10th and 19th, the very period in which the raid would take place. The first disaster struck before anyone reached the shore. At 0348 hours, the Eastern Assault Group carrying No. 3 Commando blundered into a small German coastal convoy in the darkness of the Channel. A brief, vicious sea battle erupted. The convoy escort opened fire on the wooden landing craft, scattering the commando force across miles of dark water. The element of surprise upon which the entire operation depended was shattered. German shore radar stations detected the engagement. Alert signals flashed inland. The garrison at Berneval manned its battle positions. By the time the scattered remnants of No. 3 Commando reached Yellow Beach at Berneval, they landed 10 minutes late, in broad daylight, into fully alerted defences. Of the 120 men who struggled ashore, most were killed or captured within hours. Among the dead was 2nd Lieutenant Edward Lusterlot of the United States Army Rangers, the first American soldier killed in ground combat against German forces in Europe in the entire war. He fell leading his men up the cliff toward the battery, struck by machine gun fire before he reached the top. But one small boat, carrying just 20 men under Major Peter Young, landed undetected at a second point nearby. These 20 commandos climbed the cliff, crept to within 200 yards of the Goebbels battery, and opened fire with rifles and Bren guns. For approximately 2 to 3 hours, this tiny force pinned down the entire battery crew through sheer audacity and accurate shooting. The German gunners fired wildly at the fleet offshore but hit nothing of consequence. Young's men withdrew when their ammunition ran out and returned safely to England. It was a remarkable feat of initiative, but it could not change the outcome of the day. On the opposite flank, the story was very different. Number 4. Commando under Lord Lovat landed exactly on time and completely unopposed at the 2 orange beaches near Varengerville. Lovat split his 252 men into 2 groups. Major Derek Mills Roberts led 88 commandos up the cliff at Orange 1 and took up position in a wood 250 yards from the Hesse battery, opening fire with Brens, sniper rifles and 2-inch mortars. Lovat himself led the main assault group inland from Orange 2, swinging around to attack the battery from the rear. At approximately 0628 hours, after a strafing run by Spitfires, Lovat fired white signal flares. The assault went in. Captain Patrick Porteous, a Royal Artillery officer attached as liaison, had already been shot through the hand. Then he was hit again through the thigh. Despite his wounds, he led the final bayonet charge that overran the gun pits. All 6 guns were demolished with explosives. Number 4 Commando withdrew on schedule, re-embarking by 0730 with their wounded. Their casualties were 12 killed, 20 wounded and 13 missing. It was a textbook operation, later studied in military academies for decades. Porteous was awarded the Victoria Cross. Lovett received the Distinguished Service Order. It was the only unqualified success of the entire day. At Puys, designated Blue Beach, the story was pure horror. The Royal Regiment of Canada, 554 men, were to land at dawn and seize the eastern headland, whose guns overlooked the main Dieppe beach. But navigational difficulties and the confusion caused by the naval engagement to the east put them roughly 20 minutes late. They touched down after dawn had fully broken in broad daylight against defenders who had been standing to since the sound of gunfire first echoed across the water. The beach at Puys was narrow, hemmed in by cliffs on both sides, closed at its head by a concrete seawall 10 feet high, topped with thick belts of barbed wire. German machine gunners in the cliffs above had perfect interlocking fields of fire that covered every square metre of the killing ground below. The ramps of the landing craft dropped. The Canadians surged forward into a storm of fire so intense that entire sections were cut down before they had taken 10 steps. Men fell in heaps at the base of the seawall. Those who reached it found no way over or through the wire. A handful of soldiers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Catto, somehow got over the wall and into the orchards above, but they were quickly cut off and forced to surrender. The rest lay on the narrow strip of pebbles, pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, while German fire methodically swept the beach. Of the 554 men who landed at Puys, 227 were killed. Only 33 men returned to England unwounded. The Royal Regiment of Canada suffered the heaviest single-day loss of any Canadian battalion in the entire Second World War. At Pourville, designated Green Beach, the South Saskatchewan Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Cecil Merritt achieved initial surprise, but a navigational error landed most of the battalion on the wrong side of the small River Sy that runs through the village. To reach their objectives, the men had to cross a narrow bridge that quickly became a target for German mortar and machine gun fire. Bodies piled up on the bridge. The advance stalled. Then Merritt did something extraordinary. He walked out onto the bridge in full view of the enemy, waving his steel helmet above his head. He called out to his men to follow him, shouting that there was nothing to worry about. He crossed and recrossed that bridge multiple times, each time rallying another group of soldiers to dash across behind him. Elements of the South Saskatchewans pushed inland nearly 2 miles, the deepest Allied penetration of the day, but they could not reach their final objectives. When German reinforcements closed in, Merritt organised the rearguard that covered the withdrawal of the survivors to the beach. He fought until his ammunition was exhausted, then was captured. Merritt was awarded the Victoria Cross. On the main Dieppe beach, the catastrophe was total. The Essex Scottish Regiment landed on Red Beach, the eastern section of the Esplanade. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed on White Beach, the western section near the casino. They went in at 0520 hours, 30 minutes after the flank attacks, into a garrison that was now fully awake and fully manned. There had been no heavy bombing. The brief naval bombardment by 4-inch guns had done nothing to suppress the German positions dug deep into concrete and cliff face. Hurricane fighters strafed the seafront, but cannon shells bounced off the fortifications. The Essex Scottish were caught in a near-perfect crossfire the moment they left their landing craft. Most never got beyond the waterline. Entire companies were pinned down on the open pebbles within yards of the sea. Men dug frantically into the stones with their hands and helmets, trying to scrape some depression in the shingle that might offer a few inches of protection from the bullets that cracked and whined overhead. The dead and the wounded lay where they fell, on the wet pebbles at the water's edge, on the esplanade, slumped against the seawall. The Rileys fought their way into the casino and cleared it room by room in savage close-quarters fighting. Small parties pushed several blocks into the town beyond, but without reinforcement they could not hold. On White Beach, amid the carnage, one man moved through the fire with a calm that those who witnessed it would never forget. Honorary Captain John Weir Foote was the chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. He was not a combatant. He carried no weapon. But from the moment the ramps dropped, Foote walked repeatedly across the bullet-swept beach to reach wounded men, drag them to the regimental aid post, and carry them to the landing craft for evacuation. He did this not once, but dozens of times, crossing open ground under fire that killed armed soldiers all around him. When the last evacuation boat was preparing to leave, Foote stepped aboard. Then he stopped. He looked back at the beach where scores of wounded Canadians lay who could not be moved. He stepped off the boat, walked back across the pebbles, and chose to remain with the men who could not escape. He spent the next 3 years as a prisoner of war. Foote was awarded the Victoria Cross, the first ever given to a Canadian military chaplain. His citation was not published until 1946, after his liberation from a German prisoner of war camp. The tanks were supposed to change everything. The Calgary Regiment brought the Churchill tank into combat for the first time anywhere in the world. 29 Churchills were landed on the main beach, but the large, loose pebbles that covered the shore either bogged the tracks or broke them. A dozen tanks could not get off the beach at all. Of the 15 that climbed the seawall onto the esplanade, not one could pass the concrete anti-tank obstacles blocking every street. The Royal Canadian Engineers who were supposed to blow these obstacles had been killed before they could place their charges. The surviving tanks cruised back and forth along the promenade, firing at the cliff-face bunkers until their ammunition ran out or their tracks were destroyed. Every single one of the 29 tanks that landed was lost. Then came the fatal misunderstanding that turned disaster into catastrophe. A garbled radio message from the beach was interpreted aboard HMS Calpe as meaning that the Essex Scottish had broken through into the town. Based on this false report, Major General Roberts committed his floating reserve, the Fusilier Mont Royal, to reinforce what he believed was a successful penetration. They landed directly into the killing ground. The battalion was devastated. Casualties were staggering, with the vast majority of the men who went ashore killed, wounded, or captured, and nearly all of their officers lost. Later, Royal Marine A Commando attempted to reinforce as well. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Picton Phillips, standing on the deck of his landing craft and seeing the scale of the slaughter ahead, waved frantically to signal the craft behind him to turn back. He was shot and killed as he stood there. Most of the Marines reversed course. Those who landed suffered heavily. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Roberts and Hughes Hallett accepted that the assault had failed completely. They gave the order for withdrawal to begin at 1100 hours. A desperate evacuation began under withering fire. Landing craft were sunk by the dozen as they tried to reach the beaches. Some boats managed to pull men from the water. Others were destroyed before they could get close. On the main beach, hundreds of Canadian soldiers who could not be evacuated surrendered. The last boats left the shoreline around 12:40 in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, all surviving ships were clear of the French coast. Operation Jubilee was over. It had lasted less than 10 hours. In the skies above Dieppe, the RAF fought the largest single-day air battle of the war to that point. 74 Allied squadrons engaged the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26. The RAF lost 106 aircraft, the highest single-day total in the entire war. 62 Allied aircrew were killed. The Luftwaffe lost 48 aircraft. The air umbrella had prevented the German bombers from destroying the fleet, but at an enormous cost. When the final accounting was done, the numbers were devastating. Of the 4,963 Canadians who had embarked, 3,367 became casualties. More than 900 were killed. 1,946 were taken prisoner. The casualty rate was nearly 68%, higher than the worst battles of the First World War. The Royal Navy suffered 550 casualties and lost the destroyer HMS Berkeley, which had to be scuttled after a German bomb struck her on the return crossing. 33 landing craft were destroyed. The total Allied losses from the force that landed exceeded 3,600 killed, wounded or captured out of approximately 6,100 men. The German defenders, by contrast, suffered fewer than 600 casualties in total, with roughly 320 killed. They had repelled a major amphibious assault with a ratio of losses running at roughly 7-1 in their favour. For the nearly 2,000 Canadians taken prisoner, the ordeal was far from over. They were marched through the streets of Dieppe, past the bodies of their comrades, hands raised above their heads. German newsreel cameras filmed their humiliation for propaganda broadcast across occupied Europe. Many of the prisoners were wounded and received only rudimentary medical care in the first hours. They were transported to prisoner of war camps deep in Germany, where they would spend the next 2.5 years behind barbed wire. In October 1942, in retaliation for an Allied order that German prisoners captured during the raid should have their hands bound, Hitler ordered that the Canadian prisoners at Dieppe be shackled. For months, the men had their wrists chained together with handcuffs or rope, a violation of the Geneva Convention that added a layer of daily misery to the already grinding monotony of captivity. The shackling only ended after prolonged diplomatic protests through neutral channels. Many of these men would not return to Canada until the spring of 1945, thin, exhausted, and carrying memories they would struggle to put into words for the rest of their lives. News of the raid was presented to the Allied public as a success. British newspapers ran headlines describing a bold reconnaissance in force. Mountbatten's publicity team at Combined Operations described Jubilee as a deliberate test that had achieved its objectives. The British Army Press Service initially failed even to mention that the bulk of the troops engaged were Canadian, an oversight that took weeks to correct and that left a lasting sting in Canada. But within weeks, the truth could no longer be hidden. Long casualty lists appeared in newspapers across Canada. Communities from Toronto to Regina to Montreal to Calgary were devastated. Entire regiments had effectively ceased to exist. The Royal Regiment of Canada, recruited from the streets and neighbourhoods of Toronto, had lost more men in a single morning than most battalions lost in a year of fighting. The Essex Scottish, drawn from the border city of Windsor, Ontario, was shattered. The Calgary Regiment had lost every one of its tanks and a generation of trained tank crews. In small towns across Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Cameron Highlanders had recruited, families who had watched their sons march away to war now learned that those sons were dead, missing, or behind German wire. Ministers and priests made house calls that no amount of training had prepared them for. Gold Star flags appeared in windows. Entire streets fell silent with grief. Families received the dreaded telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands and fathers were dead, captured or missing. Mothers who had kissed their boys goodbye at railway stations in Hamilton and Winnipeg and Montreal would never see them again. Young wives became widows. Children grew up knowing their fathers only from photographs hung on parlour walls, and for weeks and months afterward, the uncertainty was almost worse than the knowledge. Families of the missing waited for follow-up telegrams that might confirm death or, mercifully, captivity. Some waited months before learning which it was. In Canada, a bitter conviction took hold that would never fully fade. Canadian soldiers had been used as guinea pigs in a British planned operation over which Canadian commanders had no meaningful control. Major General Roberts had been handed the role of executor, not designer. Neither the Canadian Corps commander nor the Army commander had taken part in the planning. Roberts received the Distinguished Service Order after the raid, a decoration that struck many Canadians as insulting. He was quietly relieved of divisional command following a failed training exercise in early 1943 and saw no further frontline service. Mountbatten bore the brunt of the criticism that followed, though the question of who truly authorised the operation remains unresolved to this day. But the aftermath of Dieppe was not only grief and recrimination. It was also, perhaps, salvation. The lessons extracted from the carnage on those pebbled beaches fundamentally transformed the way the Allies planned every subsequent amphibious operation of the war. Each lesson was paid for in Canadian blood, but each would save lives when the time came to return to France in force. The first and most critical lesson was that a heavily fortified port could not be captured by frontal assault. The Dieppe plan had assumed that surprise and boldness would compensate for the absence of overwhelming firepower. The assumption was destroyed along with the men who tested it. Instead of trying to seize a port, the planners of D-Day decided to land over open beaches and bring their own port with them. This drove the acceleration of the Mulberry artificial harbour programme. The idea of portable harbours was not new. Churchill himself had sketched the concept during the First World War. But it was at a meeting following the Dieppe disaster that Captain Hughes Hallett, the raid's naval commander, made his famous declaration that if a port could not be captured, one must be taken across the channel. From that moment, what had been an intermittent idea became a focused engineering programme. The enormous prefabricated structures were towed across the channel and assembled off the coast of Normandy, one of the most ambitious engineering feats of the war. The second lesson was that no amphibious assault could succeed without massive preliminary bombardment. At Dieppe, the defenders had been neither softened nor suppressed. By June 6, 1944, the Normandy landings were preceded by 5,000 tons of bombs dropped by heavy bombers, followed by the guns of 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and more than 90 destroyers. The kind of naval firepower that the Admiralty had flatly refused to commit at Dieppe was provided in overwhelming abundance at Normandy. The third lesson was the need for specialized armored vehicles designed specifically to defeat beach defenses. The destruction of the Calgary Regiment's Churchills, bogged in pebbles and stopped by obstacles they could not breach, led directly to the creation of one of the war's most remarkable military formations. In early 1943, the 79th Armoured Division was reorganized under Major General Percy Hobart, a brilliant and eccentric tank pioneer whom Churchill had personally rescued from the Home Guard in 1940, where Hobart had been serving as a lance corporal after being forced into retirement and reinstated to active command. Hobart developed an extraordinary collection of modified tanks that the troops nicknamed Hobart's Funnies. There were duplex-drive amphibious Shermans that could swim to shore under their own power. There were crab flail tanks that beat the ground ahead of them with chains to detonate mines. There were Churchill AVRE tanks, armoured vehicles, Royal Engineers mounting massive demolition mortars that could blast concrete bunkers apart. There were bobbin tanks that unrolled matting over soft ground, crocodile flamethrower tanks that could burn out a strong point from 100 yards, and bridge-laying tanks that could span an anti-tank ditch in under 2 minutes. On D-Day, these vehicles led the assault on the British and Canadian beaches at Gold, Juno, and Sword. They materially reduced casualties and were one of the critical factors in the success of the landings. The fourth lesson was that battlefield communications had to be robust, redundant, and reliable. At Dieppe, the majority of wireless sets carried ashore by the infantry were destroyed or failed to function after the initial landings. Roberts, sitting aboard HMS Calpe, had received fragmentary, contradictory, and often false reports that led directly to the fatal commitment of the reserves. By 1944, the number of radios, frequencies, and headquarters ships had been multiplied many times over. Forward observation officers went ashore with the first wave to direct naval gunfire in real time. The fifth lesson was that intelligence gathering before an amphibious assault had to be thorough, meticulous, and accurate. At Dieppe, the pre-raid assessment of the beach gradient, the composition of the shore, and the layout of enemy defences had been based partly on examination of holiday postcards and pre-war tourist photographs. By 1944, beach reconnaissance was carried out by the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, specialist teams using midget submarines and swimmers to survey every yard of the Normandy coastline before the invasion fleet sailed. The history of amphibious warfare is littered with similar disasters, each one a painful education in the cost of attacking a defended shore. At Gallipoli in 1915, another operation championed by Winston Churchill, British, Australian, New Zealand and French forces had landed on the Turkish peninsula against well-prepared defenders on high ground, with inadequate fire support and confused command. Allied casualties exceeded 250,000 over 8 months, a strategic defeat that helped define the national identities of Australia and New Zealand and ended Churchill's first period in government. At Tarawa in November 1943, American Marines assaulted a tiny coral island held by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops in fortified positions. A miscalculation of the tide left the landing craft grounded on the reef hundreds of yards from shore, forcing the Marines to wade through chest-deep water under murderous fire. Roughly 1,000 Marines were killed and 2,300 wounded in 76 hours of combat. At Salerno in September 1943, the Allied landing in Italy nearly failed in the face of a determined German counterattack. Each of these operations proved the same brutal truth. Attacking a defended coast was the most dangerous operation in warfare, and the margin between success and catastrophe was measured not in grand strategy, but in the small, hard details of fire support, communications, engineering, and intelligence. What made Dieppe different from these other disasters was not the scale of the losses, but the directness of the line connecting its failures to the solutions employed on D-Day. The Mulberry harbours were conceived because Dieppe proved that capturing a port was too costly. Hobart's Funnies were built because Dieppe proved that standard tanks could not overcome beach obstacles. The massive naval bombardment at Normandy was provided because Dieppe proved that 4-inch guns were not enough. The improved radios and headquarters ships of 1944 were developed because Dieppe proved that commanders needed to see and hear the battlefield in real time. The connection was not abstract or theoretical. It was direct, specific, and documented in the after-action reports that circulated through every planning headquarters in Britain for the next 2 years. The German command drew its own conclusions from Dieppe, and some of those conclusions would prove equally consequential. Adolf Hitler, studying the captured operational orders, concluded that the Allies would attempt their main invasion against a fortified port. He ordered the strengthening of the Atlantic Wall and gave highest priority to the fortification of the Channel ports, including Calais, Boulogne, Dieppe, Le Havre, and Cherbourg. Thousands of tons of concrete were poured into port defences. Additional gun batteries were emplaced. Garrison strengths were increased. This decision, driven in part by the Dieppe experience, meant that resources were concentrated on port defences rather than on the open beaches between them. When the Allies finally came ashore in Normandy, they landed not at a port, but across 50 miles of open coastline that the Germans had considered a secondary target. The great fortress ports that Hitler had so lavishly fortified were bypassed entirely. They held out for weeks, some for months, but they were irrelevant to the main battle. In one of the war's great ironies, Germany's response to the Dieppe raid helped create the very vulnerability that the Allies exploited on D-Day. Today, the men who fought at Dieppe are remembered in stone and ceremony on both sides of the Atlantic. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery at Hautot-sur-Mer, 5 kilometres south of the town, holds the graves of nearly 950 Commonwealth servicemen, the majority of them Canadian. Many remain unidentified. It was begun by the Germans themselves, who buried the Allied dead with care, and it was the first completed Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery of the Second World War, opened in 1949. In Dieppe itself, the seafront esplanade carries plaques to every Canadian regiment that fought there. The Square du Canada in the western end of the town contains a monument whose French inscription, preserved since the liberation, reads in part that on August 19th, 1942, on the beaches of Dieppe, our Canadian cousins marked with their blood the road to our final liberation, foretelling their victorious return on September 1st, 1944. That return was real. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, rebuilt and reinforced, was among the forces that liberated Dieppe on September 1st, 1944, exactly 2 years and 13 days after the raid. The same division, the same town. But this time they came in overwhelming force, and the Germans withdrew without a fight. In Canada, memorials to the Dieppe dead stand in Toronto, Hamilton, Windsor, Calgary, Montreal, Regina, and Winnipeg, in the home cities of every regiment that was shattered on those beaches. The 19th of August is observed as Dieppe Raid Day across Canada. Major commemorations are held at the National War Memorial in Ottawa and in Dieppe itself, and the 80th anniversary in 2022 drew official government delegations from Canada and allied nations. In the regimental messes of the units that fought at Dieppe, the memory is kept alive in a more personal way. The names of the fallen are read aloud. Their photographs hang on the walls. Their battle honours are stitched into the regimental colours. Young soldiers in those same regiments learn the story of Dieppe as part of their own identity, as an inheritance of duty and sacrifice that belongs specifically to them. In Canadian memory, Dieppe occupies a place alongside Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, not as a victory to celebrate, but as a sacrifice to honour, a moment when the price of war fell disproportionately and perhaps unnecessarily on Canadian shoulders. Mountbatten later defended the raid with a claim he repeated for the rest of his life. He said that for every man who died at Dieppe, at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944. The arithmetic has been challenged by virtually every serious historian. The number 10 was rhetorical, not calculated. Colonel Patrick Porteous, who as a young captain had won the only British Victoria Cross at Dieppe, dismissed the claim decades later, saying that the same lessons could have been learned in Weymouth Bay without sending men to die on a French beach. Others have pointed out that the fundamental principles of amphibious warfare, the need for fire support, the importance of surprise, the danger of frontal assault, had already been codified by the United States Marine Corps before the war and demonstrated at Gallipoli a generation earlier. The debate will never be settled. What cannot be denied is that more than 900 Canadian soldiers, 75 British sailors, 62 Allied airmen and dozens of commandos and rangers died at Dieppe on a single August morning. They were not killed in a great decisive battle that turned the tide of the war. They were killed in a raid that failed in almost every respect, a raid that was poorly planned, inadequately supported and launched against a target whose defences were stronger than the planners believed or acknowledged. They were fathers, sons, and brothers. They were volunteers who had crossed an ocean to fight for a country many of them had never seen. They trained for years and were given less than 10 hours to prove themselves, 10 hours in which the odds were stacked against them, from the moment the first landing craft scraped against the pebbles. The story of Dieppe is not a story of glory. It is a story of what happens when ambition outpaces preparation, when political pressure overrides military judgment, when commanders send men into battle without the tools they need to survive. It is also, in its painful aftermath, a story of learning. The Allies took the blood-soaked lessons of that August morning and applied them with ruthless discipline over the next 2 years. They built the artificial harbours, they developed the specialised tanks. They multiplied the radios and the headquarters ships. They committed the battleships and the bombers. And when they finally returned to France on June 6, 1944, they came ashore on open beaches, not through a fortified port, supported by firepower that would have been unimaginable at Dieppe. The men who died on the beaches of Dieppe never knew any of this. They never knew that their sacrifice would be studied, debated, and ultimately used to reshape the greatest amphibious invasion in history. They knew only the cold channel water, the loose pebbles dragging at their boots, and the relentless hammering of the guns from the cliffs above. They deserved better than the plan they were given. But the legacy they left behind, measured not in monuments but in lives saved on other beaches in other years, is beyond calculation. There is a particular cruelty in the story of Dieppe that sets it apart from other wartime tragedies. The men who died there were not overwhelmed by superior numbers or caught by an enemy they could not have anticipated. They were sent against a target whose defences were known, with resources that everyone involved understood were inadequate, under a plan that had already been abandoned once for reasons of common sense. The machinery of decision that put them on those beaches was driven not by military logic, but by political necessity, by the need to show allies and enemies alike that Britain and Canada were willing to fight on the continent of Europe. The men who paid the price for that demonstration had no say in the calculation and no knowledge of the forces that shaped their fate. That is the cruel arithmetic of Dieppe, a disaster that became a foundation, a slaughter that became a lesson, a day of death that 2 years later helped make possible the liberation of an entire continent. And behind every number, behind every statistic and strategic assessment, there were real men who crossed a dark sea on a summer night and never came home.